Good morning. Happy Mother's Day. I'm Erin. I am mom to two girls. Sadie is 9 and Kinsley is 11, and I'm Jonathan's wife who spoke last week, so you get a double dose of bots. We'll stop our takeover next week, I promise. In preparing to share a few words today, I looked up a few kind of fun motherhood quotes. I wanted to start with those. A good mom lets her kids lick the beaters. A great mom turns them off first. Nothing is really lost until your mother can't find it. If at first you don't succeed, try doing it the way your mother told you from the start. Every day I wake up and think, how on earth did I become this much like my mother? Jokes aside, I have the best mom in the world. She's not here today. She's at her own church, but any day that I feel like or I'm told that I'm like her is the best day ever. My mom is a Christian woman. She has a designated rocking chair in her prayer closet, and at any given time, I know I have at least one prayer group praying for me or Jonathan or the girls or everything. She also sends everything out on text, so there's no secrets in my family. But she was instrumental in me developing my faith. Coming up as a child, I was raised Catholic, and we ultimately kind of became non-denominational Christian, but she taught me what it was like to have a personal relationship with God, so that was just instrumental for me. When I'm having a bad day, she's the one I want to talk to. She's a rock. She's not perfect. Sorry, Mom. But she birthed perfection, so she's about as close as you can get. And I'm not talking about my brother. I've always been someone that uses humor and laughter to get me through uncomfortable situations like public speaking, for better or worse. I like to break the tension, to ease discomfort, and sometimes it's just a natural reaction for me at inopportune times. When our oldest Kinsley was about 7, we took her to her first amusement park, and I convinced her to go on this wooden roller coaster with me. And I was so excited. I love roller coasters. So we get strapped in, and she has the biggest smile on her face until the car starts to move. And we're moving out of the little section where they strap you in, and she looks at me with her big blue eyes, and she was like, "Mommy, I think I changed my mind." And I looked at her, and I was like, "All right, you can't, so we're just going to do this. We're going to do it. You're strong." So that the roller coaster is going up, the click, 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 and we get to the top, and it gets silent, and we just start to descend. And she looks at me, and she says, "I changed my mind!" And I died. I laughed so hard the rest of the roller coaster ride. I think I had snot coming out of my nose. I could not stop. I could not control it, and I felt awful, but I couldn't stop because it was a situation I couldn't control, and I laugh when it's, maybe awkward to laugh. I think that's probably going to come up in therapy someday, but if that's the only thing she's talking about, I'm doing all right. Might be my only mistake so far. It's not. In all seriousness, kind of touching on what Sean was saying, I know that Mother's Day can be exceptionally hard for a lot of people. Maybe women that have tried to become moms but couldn't, anyone that's lost their mom, maybe lost a child. This can be a really, really tough day. And so I find comfort in the words of John 16:33. "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world." Don't stay alone in your grief if today is a hard day. Give yourself permission to feel what you're feeling. It's normal and okay. I've been reading through the Old Testament this year. My penchant for relying on laughter and sometimes inopportune moments helped me connect to the story of Sarah in Genesis. Laughter is a theme woven within her tale, but so is heartbreak, yearning, and faith. Sarah's story is primarily a story about waiting. We see the themes of fear and doubt at odds with hope and faith. Sarah's story provides both the how-to and the how not to wait on the Lord. She's so real. She deals with issues that most of us have or will deal with: infertility, marriage struggles, jealousy, disbelief, fear, and doubt. She also makes plenty of mistakes along the way, which I can relate to. For me, her story inspires the question of what I do during times of waiting on the Lord, and I think we can all learn something from that, because in one way or another, we're all waiting on the Lord for something. Sarah was born in present-day Iraq into an advanced pagan culture in the post-Babel world. She's described as beautiful, faithful, and loyal. She married Abraham, and when we meet Sarah, she's introduced in Genesis as a barren woman having had no children. So I don't know if anyone here watches reality shows, but I imagine Sarah's face pops up and it says, "Sarah, barren." Not exactly how you want to be introduced, but sometimes the Old Testament highlights the struggles of life. It was a teaching tool. So just as struggling with fertility is so difficult for so many women, perhaps some of you in the crowd today, being barren was devastating in Sarah's time. A woman's job was to marry and have children. She suffered deep shame if she was unable to do this, and often barrenness was attributed to some hidden wrong, sin, or flaw, and these women were seen as separated from God. How many of us in this room have labeled ourselves and feel we are to blame for some hidden wrong, sin, or flaw, even though it's no fault of our own? Maybe you label yourself as a failure, as a cheater, as a not good enougher. We all carry these labels. So we're going to take a quick glance across multiple chapters of Genesis to learn more about Sarah's story. We start in Genesis 12. Sarah and Abraham are still living in what is now present-day Iraq in this pagan culture, so not really God-friendly, so to speak. They probably had many gods, but not the God. The Lord came to Abraham, and he said, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing." So Abraham went, which means Sarah went. They obeyed immediately. They began their journey from Iraq through present-day Syria and ultimately into Canaan, east of Bethel, which is in the promised land that God was giving them, which is Israel. Abraham's and Sarah's life was chaos at this time. They left a stable city environment and became nomads living in tents. When they arrived in the promised land, the Lord appeared again to them. And he said, "To your offspring, I will give this land." He's confirming the promise to them again. Soon after, there was a famine, and Abraham and Sarah traveled to Egypt. They became very wealthy there, and they returned again to the promised land, and God again returned to them. And he said, "All the land which you can see will be your descendants. And he will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants could also be numbered." God returned again to Abraham after this, again, to reaffirm his promise that Abraham's very own son would be his heir. God repeated his promise to Abraham again and again, but it was a promise without a timeline. Have you ever been waiting on the Lord to act? Have you wondered how long it would take? You're not alone. Sarah and Abraham waited. From the time of the first promise, when they were still living in Iraq, they waited 11 years. Sarah found herself still barren, and I imagine she felt completely out of control and probably forgotten by God. She had to be frustrated and fearful, doubting that God's promise would happen before she died. At this point, she was already 75 years old. Allowing her fear and doubt to guide her decision-making, she found a human solution to a supernatural promise that she and Abraham were given. I imagine she sat in her tent talking to the other women saying, I know God, this God created heaven and earth, light and dark, animals, people. He controls everything, controls the weather. But maybe he needs some help with this problem. And so she decided on a plan B. She offered her servant, Hagar, to Abraham so that she might conceive a son for them. This was the culturally appropriate decision for Sarah to make. It was common for women who were unable to have children to offer a servant to their husband as a surrogate. But as Proverbs 3 warns, Sarah was wise in her own eyes in this decision. The plan was destined to fail. It resulted in the birth of Ishmael, the ancestor of Muhammad, who was the founder of Islam. And to this day, the ancestors of Ishmael have been at war with the promised generations of Abraham. 14 years after his birth, so we're nearly 25 years after the initial promise that Abraham and Sarah would have a child, God returned to Abraham. Abraham was 99. Sarah was almost 90. And in Genesis 18:10, the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." Abraham laughed, believing that at his old age it was inconceivable, but he was full of joy in his laughter. Now, Sarah's my girl, because she was listening at the tent door like any good wife, and she also laughed. But hers was a laugh of disbelief, and it was at an inopportune moment. It was her roller coaster moment, and God called her out for it. His response in Genesis 18:14 was, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" 1 year later, in Genesis 21, Isaac was born. His name means he laughs in Hebrew. His birth was a fulfillment of God's promise that Abraham and Sarah become the mother and father of nations. You can follow his descendants from his son Jacob and all the way down through Boaz, who we just learned about in Ruth, and ultimately to a sweet baby boy born in a manger in Bethlehem. From Abraham and Sarah, the nation of Israel grew exponentially, leading to the birth of its Savior Jesus and the land promised to Abraham thousands of years earlier. Now that's a promise kept. I want to clarify something in this story, though. Fertility wasn't the main point. I think often we read a story like this, especially on a day like today, and we say, Sarah was faithful, so she got pregnant. You can be faithful and never get pregnant, or never get the job, or never get married. Sarah was specifically promised to bear a child. Her faithfulness in the wait is what is credited to her as righteousness. God's reward for our faithfulness during periods of waiting is often the softening of our hearts and the building of our character, and less so the tangible gifts that we might receive. I just really love Sarah throughout this story. She messed up so big at times. She offered another woman to her husband. Then she got mad at her husband because he went with another woman. She was horrible to the woman that had the baby. And then she laughed at God and lied to God about laughing at him. Yet Hebrews 11:11 in the New Testament says, by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. Sarah didn't have to be perfect, make all the right decisions, and wait with her hands folded in her lap. It was okay if she laughed at inopportune times. She just needed faith that God is a God of his word, and he is. That's just so freeing, especially for me as a mom. I have and will make so many mistakes long before the roller coaster incident. I've been doing them since they were born. But I know that when I hold fast to God's promise for me and for my children, that he will use all things for his good. That doesn't mean without struggle. Sarah waited almost 90 years for a baby. We will watch our children suffer and make wrong choices for God. But he's there. And at the end of our lives, if we have allowed him to guide us, he will see us as women or men of faith rather than women and men of mistakes. Sarah waited on the Lord's promise for a long time, but as time elapsed, fear and doubt crept in. All of Sarah's previous insecurities snuck in. Was she good enough? Did God really mean that she would be blessed? Maybe she had sinned too much to become a mom. Does anyone have problems with self-talk here? Especially when we're waiting on the Lord to act. These insecurities are the nutrients required to grow fear and doubt. And the enemy loves using fear and doubt to separate us from the promises we have in God. I actually found myself waiting on the Lord soon after I became a mom, so a little bit different than Sarah. I became pregnant very quickly and didn't physically have to wait for a baby for very long, other than the 10 plus months of pregnancy. Once my oldest Kinsley was born, I had a very difficult time with what I now know to be postpartum depression. I remember sitting at wake late at night in a dark room, rocking this crying baby, trying to get her to sleep, and just wondering when God might help me feel like a mom. This went on for months, and I felt emotionally numb and disconnected. I began to believe that I wasn't good enough to be a mom. For a while, I felt spiritually barren. I felt empty. I felt alone. I questioned whether I should try to have more children. I was stuck. I was frozen in a period of doubt and fear, waiting for God to rescue me, but not really doing anything to get out of that hole. Instead of prayer during those dark hours of diaper changing and feeding in the middle of the night, I filled my emptiness with Netflix. During the day, if I had a quiet moment, I wasn't praying or reading the Bible. Thankfully, I was surrounded by an amazing group of friends and a wonderful husband, of course, that sent me Bible verses and prayed for me and encouraged me to start attending Bible study again. And slowly I started to lean on my faith. I got back into daily quiet time routine, and instead of focusing on all the things that felt outside of my control, I focused on what I knew. That even though I felt alone, God had placed a supportive husband and incredible friends in my life to show me his light. He had provided an abundant life for me. I just had to look outside myself to see it. I read a devotional recently, and I loved this quote. In our waiting, we can choose to doubt God's goodness and faithfulness, or we can choose to remind ourselves of God's promise and his character. God used those months, years, when I felt lost and alone to build my trust in him. I'm a better mom now than I would have been having not gone through those times. I learned that God will equip me when I need to be equipped in order to raise these girls, and He will allow me to take more than I can handle so that I have to rely on Him, because there's no way I can do this well without leaning on Him for support. Motherhood, like life, can be really exciting, but it can also be really hard, and I know that every person in this room has or will experience a time of waiting for test results or a family member to return home, for a restored marriage, for a new job, for financial stability, for our children's future. God's timing is not our timing. In a world of instant gratification, waiting for unanswered prayer often feels like AOL dial-up. And I think we can all imagine that sound. So I'm going to summarize. How do we wait on the Lord? First, we build. We build a relationship with God. We read the Bible. Proverbs 3:3-5 says, let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them on your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. And in the New Testament, Hebrews 4:12 tells us, for the word of God is alive and active. The Bible is alive and active, and God will use it to speak to you. You don't need a special tool, a charm, or a ritual. You just need a Bible, a chair, and 5 minutes. We have 1,440 minutes in a day. Spend your first 5 reading His Word, seeking simply to learn about Him. It will change your life, and it will bind His Word to your heart. Step 2, we want to discern. Discern whether you are acting or not acting out of fear and doubt or faith and hope. Leaning on hope and faith doesn't mean inaction. Sarah wasn't meant to sit in a tent and do nothing. She had to take literal action. As it turns out, she was never meant to be Mary. But she chose to offer Hagar to her husband, and I think if she had sought godly counsel, she would realize this was not God's plan for her. God would not make a promise to Abraham and Sarah that excluded Sarah. As a mom, specifically a Christian mom, I have waited for my girls to develop their faith. The world tells us not to force our beliefs on our children, that they need to discover themselves and find their own way. Sarah tried to find her own way by offering Hagar to her husband, with disastrous consequences. Do we want our children to take advice from the world? If we aren't teaching them about our faith and our God, I promise the world will teach them something. I want them to know the amazing plan that God has for them. I want them to have a relationship with God so that they are faithful and they're waiting. Isaiah 30:21 says, whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. Psalm 32:8-9 says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you and watch over you. And the final step is trust. We want to trust in God's promise. Jesus said in John 10:10, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I come that they might have life and have it abundantly. God's plan was never for Sarah to suffer as she watched a servant carry and birth her husband's firstborn child. This was the enemy's plan, the human plan. God's plan for Sarah was to give birth to Isaac at the appointed time via a miraculous conception and a woman well past the age of fertility. In doing this, Sarah became the mother of nations and is known as one of the strongest women of faith in the entire Bible. So maybe no one in the room is receiving a promise to be the mother or father of nations today, but God has promised an abundant life to all of His chosen people, which is everyone here. In your period of waiting, don't allow fear and doubt to control your decision. So build your relationship with God. Discern whether your actions are based on faith and hope, and trust in God's promise. I'll end with a verse that has helped me through times of waiting, fear, and doubt. It's one of my favorites. 2 Timothy 1:7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear or timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. Except if you're on a roller coaster, all rules are off.